Before this begins, I'd like to thank Miss Stormcaller on Tumblr for translating the entirety of We Do Not Always Love You, as well as Can't Fear Your Own World, as well as the overwhelming votes on the Amino for Can't Fear Your Own World. Today on Seireitei Talk, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything Bleach related, I will be reading Can't Fear Your Own World. Once again, that is thanks to Miss Stormcaller on Tumblr. Please go support her. Check her out. Do everything. She deserves everything. Every bit of support. Without further ado, Can't Fear Your Own World, Part 1, Full Translation. Do not seek the aesthetics in waging war. Do not seek virtue in death. Do not think your life is your own. If you wish to protect each of the heads of the 4 court nobles, then you must slaughter every foe from under the shadow of the leaves. Excerpt from the old edition of the Shino Academy's textbook, Shinigami Regulation Encyclopedia. Do not seek the aesthetics in waging war. Do not seek virtue in death. Do not think your life is your own. If you wish to protect things you ought to protect, then you must strike down the enemy by cutting them from their backs. Excerpt from the latest edition of the Shino Academy's textbook, Shinigami Regulations Encyclopedia. Prologue 1. Once there was battle, a great war between those who called themselves gods, who governed death, and those who extinguished evil spirits. The conflict caused in the form of losing their respective kings. By the end of the feud, which spanned 1,000 years, the relationship between the Shinigami and the Quincy hailed a new era as a result of this great loss. It is said that it was a very same person who killed both kings. He was neither Shinigami nor Quincy, but only a small fraction of people who are aware of that fact. There was a young substitute Soul Reaper boy who was a guest of the Gotei 13, who defeated the ringleader of the Vandenreich rebel army, which invaded the Soul Society. Only a part of the information, along with the proclamation that the Gotei 13 successfully defended the Soul King's palace, was propagated throughout the Soul Society. In other words, it was to be permanently concealed by those who were the very foundation of the Soul Society. The Soul King himself was dead, for the purpose of avoiding confusion and disorder. Even now, many inhabitants of the Soul Society, including ordinary soldiers, still believe that they have their Soul King ensured in the Soul King's palace. Those who know the facts is limited to only a handful of Soul Reapers, such as captain rank and superior officers, or people who attached to important posts in the Seireitei. They also dare not expose the truth, and thus the people's peace of mind was not disturbed. From there, the reveal of the Seireitei that was left utterly devastated began. Whether or not the decision of the higher-ups, who did not deem it acceptable to snatch away the people's morale, was right, as they had expected, well, it seemed that it is something to be judged by history 10 or 100 years down the line. The series of conflicts that would subsequently be known as Protection of the Soul King Great War ushered in the conclusion to such a state of affairs. Going back in time to the point immediately following the end of the war, at the spot where the former Soul King was ensured, the holy soldiers were busily moving around. There was a member of Squad Zero, Hosoyube Ichibe monk, who calls the real name, aka High Priest. He stroked his deep black beard while silently staring at the thing that is at the center of the room. From behind, he heard an easygoing tone of voice call out to him. "Oh my. So, that is the new Soul King, High Priest?" The High Priest turned to look over his shoulder. There stood a man with an eye patch over his right eye, Shunsui Kyorako.
"Hey, you've become able to move already?" Yes. You'd be no good as Captain Commander otherwise,"
the High Priest remarked with a cheerful smile. He answered his companion's query by checking to see if Kyurako's line of sight was not on himself, but at the center of the space where the holy soldiers were working.
"You understand already. The Soul King is neither new nor old. It is significant that what we call the Soul King can continue to exist here."
Aren't you the guy that said all power is carried in names? With a complex expression still on his face, and switching to horrific speech, Kurako continued. "That is why, in the worst case scenario, it would have been Ichigo that is sealed under that name, as if it does not harbor a shred of emotion." And then he laughed, displaying a toothy grin as he spoke about Ichigo.
"I'm also pleased for that boy. To reach a point where we would be unable to talk to him would be somewhat lonesome. Huh?
Moreover, with this, I can also feel at ease not having to endure the resentment of Ichigo's friends."
"Ah, you gave them the soul tickets, didn't you? Let's keep that quiet from Central 46 and the noble families."
"Oh dear, how perceptive of you, High Priest. The position of Soul King, that is by no means a good thing. Far from the fact. Shunsui considered that the single most worst possible outcome as far as Ichigo was concerned." Looking at the thing before his eyes, Shunsui was reminded of that once again. In preparation for the worst, Shunsui handed out special spirit tools called soul tickets to the persons who were closest to Ichigo in the human world. This is a ticket that makes it possible to freely travel between the human world and Soul Society. Improvements have been made based on the technology that was previously used to transport humans of Karakura Town alive to the Soul Society, resulting in this practical substitute. Shunsui calmly casts down his eyes, scenes of the time he went to inform Ichigo Kurosaki's friends of that one possibility played out in his mind. Depending on the nature of his powers, it could mean that it would become impossible for him to return back home to this world. He said it himself that he hadn't come to joke around the young boy, despite acting the most foolish, was also filled with deep anger. "You're not joking! Yet how are you expecting us to say goodbye so easily?" In contrast, the true anger he displayed for Ichigo's sake. There was the black-haired boy who stubbornly continued to believe in Ichigo with eyes that remained calm. And then there was the girl who was most concerned about Ichigo's family, remembers rather than herself whilst harboring deep anguish and fear for Ichigo's well-being. Both Yasutaro Sado and Orihime Inoue, too. Both Yasutaro Sado and Orihime Inoue. Ichigo is blessed with friends, isn't he? Well, that is surely because those kids are captivated by Ichigo. Considering the young people of the human world, Shunsui was safely relieved for Ichigo, a key player who ended this war. Shunsui lightly lifted his eyes as he addressed the high priest. Above all, it's good that Ichigo is not being the one cut down by the high priest and company, Shunsui said without hesitation, in a curious manner of speaking. Without affirmation or denying that, the high priest rubbed his bald head as he laughed cheerfully.
Seeing as how it's not Yuha, that means I cannot see into the future. Well, technically speaking, Ichigo Kurosaki would not have won, but rather ought to have been defeated.
High priest.
So, as far as the boy is concerned, he was fortunate that Yuha had completely obtained the powers of the Soul King. It was for that reason, even regardless of the fact that Ichigo Kurosaki had won, that the Soul Society was able to escape collapse in such a way.
As he said that, the high priest clapped his hands together towards the thing that placed at the center of the great palace. Behind the high priest, whose eyes closed along with the clear sound of his hands clapping together in prayer, Shunsui tried to question him further. High priest, is that the will of the Soul King? Or is it the dying wish of the founders of the 5 great noble clans? In a slip of the tongue, the honorific language disappeared from Shunsui's voice. The high priest then replies with aloofness.
Listen that. Paying respects to the original dignitaries, you cannot hide your hostility. Do you also perceive Byakuya Kuchiki and Yoroichi Shihoin from that sort of viewpoint?
There is no place where I think of them like that. They are comrades of the Gotei 13, my precious friends. He smiled wearily as he shook his head. He continued speaking in a lower tone of his voice. The actions of their ancestors have nothing to do with them. But, on the other hand, it's not like the sins of their ancestors were non-existent. Am I right, High Priest?
You say that, but in any case, there are no longer any founders of the 5 great noble clans left.
The moment the High Priest had said that, the dull sound of an explosion echoed throughout the great palace. When Kurako turned to look in the direction of the noise, he could sense distinctive spiritual pressure, different from that of a Shinigami's, coming their way. Ahead of their sight lines, there was a section that was fused with a part of the Vandenreich. A portion of the wall was now destroyed, and white smoke followed up. Then, a few more white figures emerged from the inner part of the wall, out of this white smoke. The alarmed holy soldiers simultaneously drew their swords, adopting a fighting stance in order to defend the greater palace. But the high priest gained control of them with his commanding voice.
Ah! No need to concern yourselves. These are no opponents to defeat.
One of the white figures had already leaped in their direction. He clicked his tongue, as if drawing out a poisonous air.
Tch! What? You ain't gonna fight?
The white figure that was reminiscent of a wild beast, Grimjow Jaggerjack, glared at the high priest and Shunsui Kurako with a sharp look in his eye as he landed. Grimjow touched his hand to his Zanpakuto, but then a small bala struck the back of his head.
Ugh!
In response to the shock of something striking his head, Grimjow turned around. There stood the female Arrancar, who turned up at the Soul Society at the same time as him. Neliel tu Odelschvet, with her left hand, was pointed towards him. She had appeared to have just shot that bala.
Neliel, why you?
Picking fights on such an occasion? With the demise of the Quincy King now, it is we who are the largest foreign body in the Soul Society, you know. So what? If you're scared, then you might as well take your burden and escape through the Garganta at once. The one Grimjow had called burden was a female Arrancar who was being carried on Nell's left shoulder. Same as Nell, Tyr Halibel held the title of Espada number 3. When the Vandenreich attacked Huecomundo, Halibel stood forefront of the battle, bearing the full brunt of it. However, she was weakened by Yuha's overwhelming power. Consequently, she was captured as a symbol of Huecomundo's oppression. At the time he was remodeling the Soul King's palace, Yuha incorporated a prison into his castle, which she became his prisoner. Whether it was meant to teach the Arrancar a lesson, or even remodel her to serve as a part of the Quincy vanguard, and with Yuha now deceased, the purpose of her continued captivity had become unclear. The one thing that was for certain is that she was alive. Only now was she set free, thanks to the efforts of Neliel, who had arrived along with Ichigo Kurosaki and the others. Neliel effectively rescued Halibel, the new ruler of Huecomundo, but she held mixed feelings at the current state of affairs. Whilst feeling bewildered at the fact that it was the former subordinates themselves who were standing in the place before Aizen, who desired to reach the Soul King's palace to such a degree, Neliel addressed Grimjow, who was being hostile towards the Shinigami. "You pick fights with opponents who are exhausted from war with the Quincy's? Is that your idea of a satisfying fight?" Tuh, what a sentiment thought. Anyway, do you think these Shinigami guys are really going to turn a blind eye to us? Save me the trouble. The moment we leave, they'll slash us up from behind. It was the bald-headed, good-natured man with the deep black beard that replied to this.
Hey, don't worry. We'll turn a blind eye to you guys as much as you want. If you like, we can even escort you to Huecomundo. It's no problem.
Huh? Who do you think you are? You take us so lightly, huh? They were not even considered a threat, as they were wounded themselves. Grimjow took the remark as just that. He glared at the bald old man, his whole body overflowing with bloodlust. But the man in question replied in an unfazed manner, whilst easily brushing aside that thirst for blood.
On the contrary, the opposite is true. At any rate, even if we purified or even eradicated numerous hollows of the area, it would strongly point to the calamity as a result. Eventually, the equilibrium of the 3 realms of existence would be sure to collapse if we did such a thing so carelessly in the current state of affairs.
For a brief moment, Grimjow was silent, but then he clicked his tongue whilst bringing his bloodlust under control, whether or not he came to terms within himself. It seems he would rather settle things with Ichigo Kurosaki than mess around in this place. Neliel guessed as much. When push comes to shove, she considered silently launching a surprise attack and dragging him back to Huecomundo. Suddenly, Halibel, who was leaning on her shoulder, opened her mouth to speak. "Is that what you're all going to be calling Soul King?" She whispered her words, as if saying it to herself. Her eyes turned towards the thing being enshrined at the center of the palace, behind the Shinigami. "Such a thing is at the core of the Soul Society?"
Lady Arrancar, could you still tolerate something like this?
The bald man asked while scratching his beard at his words. Halibel slowly shook her head. "Right now, I am merely a defeated soldier. I am not qualified to be saying anything, but I understand why the man that was once our ruler continued to detest that thing." Halibel separated herself from Nell's shoulder on her own feet. She then turned her back to the Soul Reapers. "We have inconvenienced you. One of these days we will repay our debt to you." It's okay. As for this over here, it would be great if you can keep quiet about it in Huecomundo. Moreover, If you want to show your gratitude, don't thank us. You ought to be thanking Ichigo. As Shunsui said that, the Arankars showed themselves out, leaving the greater palace area. The same kind of arguing back and forth from just a moment ago could be heard. Ah, that's right. I have to repay a debt to that Ichigo bastard, the male Arankar could be heard saying, although he was speaking of a different kind of debt to the one Hollybell had mentioned earlier. In response to that, the female Arankar with the ram horn said, "Do you really wish to settle things with Ichigo with wounds all over your body?" Oh my, Ichigo is popular, isn't he? Next to the muttering Shunsui, the high priest also turns onto his feet, heading outside the greater palace. Where are you going, high priest? The Zero Division. The royal guards are elite guardians of the 5 members, including the high priest Ichibei, who are said to be comparable to the entire force of the Gote. Each member is a pioneer who has created things such as the Zanpakuto, or Shihakusho, that can be described as the very foundation of the present, present-day Soul Reaper. Perhaps it could be said that these great men and women thoroughly refined the history of the Soul Reaper from zero. However, up until Shunsui had arrived here, he had heard that the Zero Division, excluding the High Priest, had died at the hands of Yuha and his subordinates. Shunsui inclined his head at the words, "Wake up." But the answer soon came splitting out from the High Priest's mouth.
It's not the case that my own flesh and blood was converted into the Oaken just for show, you know. The spiritual pulse that surrounded the Zero Ridden, which everyone was given, is almost fused with the individual spiritual pressure of the Zero Squad. As long as the Zero Ridden are not completely destroyed, they will be revived, if I can call their names.
Translator's note. Reminder that the Zero Ridden are the separate palaces/estates of the Zero Division members. That would have been truly unfortunate if Ichigo. That would have been truly unfavorable if Ichigo didn't win. Isn't that right, High Priest? On one occasion, the Soul King's palace was reworked to Warwelt by Yuha. If Yuha was alive, before long, the last vessel of the Soul King's palace would have disappeared. With the exception of the High Priest, Squad Zero may have been, quite literally, annihilated.
The Zero Division did not die so easily. I won't let them die. Such is their fate. Well, anyway, Oetsu and the others must work harder from now on.
The High Priest spoke in an easygoing manner that was particularly similar to that of Shunsui Kurako's in times of peace. Accordingly, once he had finished speaking, he scratched his beard several times whilst looking up at the sky of the Soul King's palace.
There seems to be a young person who has taken advantage of wartime to cause a little mischief.
1 hour later, the Soul King's palace. Huden.
Oh! They've got me beat, huh?
Oetsu Nimaya had just managed to return from the boundary of life and death thanks to the efforts of the High Priest. He carried his head in his hands, deep in the basement of the Huden. There would ordinarily be a sword that exists here at the bottom of the sea, which extends around his Zero Raiden. It was a destroyed iron door, and the remains of the Shimenawa rope cut up into pieces that stared back at him through his eyeglasses. Side note, links of braided rope used to cordon off sacred or consecrated areas. There was supposed to be a certain Zanpakuto sealed there. However, that seal was tragically destroyed, and there was not a trace of the Zanpakuto in question left to be found. The girl who was standing next to Oetsu Nimaya, Mira Hyuchogashima, one of Nimaya's bodyguards and the Zanpakuto spirit, looked at the situation, exhaling a large sigh. So, this is the end result of Master getting carried away with excitement. Jeez. The sword is usually kept deep in the sea, so it is a difficult place to reach. But since it dried up at the time Ichigo Kurosaki's Zanpakuto was being forged, the floor of the sea was now widely exposed.
Even though it's an emergency, the unfavorable conditions have piled up.
Saying that, Oetsu corrected the position of his glasses as he eyed the surroundings. All of the men that were stationed there had fallen. Each were undergoing revival by Oetsu's guards, which included Tankawa Toki and Nomino Nonomi. Those who were charged with the security of the sword were all defeated. Oetsu squinted his eyes. The kind of emotions in those eyes enveloped in a quiet anger. It was different from the time he had confronted with Yuha and his Schutzstaffel.
And now, above all, there's a lowlife taking advantage of the emergency situation in the Soul Society to commit thievery.
Among the Zanpakuto that were transformed into a human form, and although they are all relatively skilled, there were no noticeably strange aspects to their injuries. There are those who had suffered burns, those who had parts of their bodies frozen, and those who kept on spasming like they had been electrocuted. Those who appeared to have been harmed with poison, those who had been pierced with holes through their bodies, up to those who seemed to have their limbs crushed with blunt instruments. Mira clicked her tongue as she observed the guards, who were covered in numerous sword wounds that were practically characterized of Zanpakuto. Good grief! How many people did this take? If they had such a military force, then they should turn to war. Then one of the Zanpakuto, who had regained his consciousness, shook his head at Mira's words.
It's not like that.
Hey, are you all right? Not like what?
They were alone when they attacked the palace. It was just one person.
Huh? Mira further tilts her head at the other's words. If his words are the truth, then the various types of scars were incomprehensible. However, Oetsu displayed a different reaction. He narrowed his eyes behind tinted glasses in the smiling expression, and nodded furiously while spreading both hands apart as if he was satisfied.
I see. Well. That's right. So it's like that.
Don't convince yourself. It gives me a bad feeling in many ways, Master. After thinking for a brief moment, Oetsu picked up a piece of the seal cloth that were scattered around on the floor whilst calling to mind a specific person. As he observed that cloth, which looked as if something had bitten it off, he mumbled to himself. No sword should be handled by a small fry, but Ikomi Kidome is not a sword that can be handled by a small fry in the first place. Whilst he whispered the name of the Zanpakuto that had disappeared, Oetsu glared at the empty space with a slight sadness and anger as a swordsmith. His eyes were enshrouded in heavy doubt. If that's so, then I wonder who intends to wield it. And with the conclusion of the war, the boundaries of the Soul King's palace was closed off once again. The frozen atmosphere makes one feel remnant of war, and the influence of the Soul King that remains as unchanged as before. Even more so, the several live costs of calamity. Alternative, letting the various crimes that persist since the dawn of the Soul Society float within its pronounced reishi. End of Prologue 1.